Recording in progress.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I call the Wednesday, September 28th, 4 p.m. MPO Policy Board meeting to order. And I will need to do the roll call because I stole Sandy's list of people. She said I had to do that task. So I'll just go through the list. Supervisor Mallard.
Present.
Councilor Pinkston. Present. Mayor Snook. Present. Mr. Nelson. Present. And is Ms. Laundrie joining us?
Yes.
So there you go. I'm sorry. And Mr. Reed. Here. Ms. Monty.
Present.
Mr. Williams. All right, Mr. Hudson, I see you're online. Well, I'm going to use the visual confirmation.
So he's still connecting.
Oh, okay. So not quite there yet. And I've got Mr. Duran. Let's see. Mr. Long. And I see Mr. Condor is online. CTAC. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Proctor, is Chuck Lewis? You standing in for, I was just going to say, okay, now this is there. So Mr. Barnes, you're standing in for Mr. Proctor. All right, very good. Roll call is complete. Sandy, anything else I have to do there?
No, we have four, so feel free to move forward.
Move on. So the next item, matters from the public. We'll limit 3 minutes per speaker. We welcome anyone who'd like to come forward and give a comment today. Anyone here in the room or online want to give a comment? All right. Seeing none, we will close matters from the public and move to item number 3. Sandy, you're going to take us through, well, I guess we'll just go ahead with the acceptance of the agenda and move through this. I saw your name, so we do need to approve the agenda that's in front of us. Are there any changes to it?
Move its approval.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We need to approve the July 27th, 22 meeting minutes. And we also have the August 26th special meeting minutes. So we'll try to do this separately, I suppose. Anyone like to make a motion to approve July 27th?
Second.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And then a motion to approve the August 26th, 22 special meeting minutes.
Second again.
All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you very much. All right, moving right along. We're already way ahead of schedule. So number 4, remote participation and virtual meeting policy. And Sandy, are you kicking that off or?
I am actually, we are in the esteemed presence of David Lawrence, so I'm going to let him lead this discussion.
Very good. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the MPO. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Like, sounds like I'm really loud though. I'm going to turn my volume down a little bit. Is that still okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. You have a memo and proposed policy in your packet today that's really necessitated by some changes that were made at the General Assembly with regard to remote participation in public meetings by members of the public body, and also for holding all virtual meetings. Those changes were made and are effective as of just under a month ago on September 1st. So the policy that you have before you for consideration really would replace policy that you had previously adopted to address both of those issues that I mentioned. The policy has a policy statement, which are basically reiterating some provisions that are contained in the code. And then there are separate sections, one for the remote participation by individual members, and the second section for all virtual meetings. You will find that the first section on remote participation is what you've been doing, under the past couple of years when you had virtual meetings during the COVID emergency declaration. If a member wishes to participate remotely, they have to make a notification to the chair, to the staff. There has to be a quorum physically assembled in order, in person, in order to allow the person to participate remotely. You have to have a policy in place, which you did. And then there are 4 reasons by which you can state that you would like to participate remotely. All of those are the same under the new provisions of the code. They are unlimited with the exception of personal matters, which can only be used 2 times or 25% of meetings, whichever is greater. What's going to be new to you is for the provisions related to the all virtual meetings. And here what we tried to do was really just encompass those items which are enumerated in the state code for situations where you would have an all virtual meeting. I think that you will also find that those items you were doing during COVID in terms of providing access to the public, providing an opportunity for public comment. There is a limitation on the number of all virtual meetings that the MPO and its committees could have. And similar to the remote participation is limited to 2 times per year, 25% of meetings, whichever is greater. And you cannot have 2 meetings consecutively that would be all virtual meetings. That is a quick rundown. Should you adopt this policy, would be applicable moving forward from its adoption, and would also be applicable to the various MPO committees that are public bodies as well.
Any questions about I feel like this point is like the 5th time. Do you need a motion? Yes, please.
I move the approval of the remote participation in the virtual meeting policy that's just described.
Second.
Right, any further discussion? All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, that policy is adopted. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
All right, next item on the agenda, number 5, fiscal year 23 Unified Planning Work Program amendments. And Sandy.
Share. I didn't do that.
Thank you.
I know it has not been very long since you all approved the FY23 Unified Planning Work Program, but there have already been some changes. So we wanted to go ahead and make sure that those were reflected and that we get our Unified Planning Work Program updated, and so we can start programming accordingly and also billing accordingly to what the funding that has been adjusted. So there are 2 main points of really 3 main points of adjustment, but 2 adjustments on the amount. The first is that we ended up getting more funding allocated for the MPO through the FHWAPL side of the funding than we had originally anticipated when the estimates were developed. And so our PL funding that was allocated for FY23, so this is new funding that came on board, was a little bit, I think it was around 40, this is really small, $47,000. That was in addition to what we had anticipated. And then the other thing that changed is that we had anticipated rolling over about $26,000 from our FY22 FTA contract. What happens with the FTA contract is that the contract period lasts beyond the fiscal year. So what happened is that we were actually able to spend down a little bit more in the FY22 contract before the end of June of the fiscal year. And so we had anticipated about $26,000 and some change being programmed for FY23 from the FY22 contract. And that amount was reduced to $25,488 based on actual expenditures. So those were the two areas where there was an actual amount that was adjusted that we needed to revise on the work program. The third thing that happened is that the rollover from the FY22 FTA side was originally all programmed to be the MPO's portion of the match for the government study. Based on the way that the government study was funded through DRPT though, they do not require that we separate out that match as a separate sort of funding allotment. So what we're doing is we're still using that amount of funding, but we're going to use it mostly to support our staff's support of the program. So it's not going to be pulled out as a separate lump sum. As a result, DRPT has requested that we spend down the FY22 contract in full before we start billing to the FY23 contract. They want us to spend old money before we spend new money and make sure that we're only working within one contract at a time. So instead of having all of this rollover funding from FY22, the FTA FY22 rollover in one subtask in the Unified Planning Work Program, we distributed it out among all three of those tasks, the administrative tasks, the long-term and the short-term planning tasks, so that we could kind of bill evenly among all of those tasks in proportion to the amount of funding that came from each of those in order to bill down the FY22 contract first. So this shows the updated table in the UPWB, and then this next table here shows the adjustment amounts based on where we programmed the funding. So the additional $47,319 we put in the on-call services category because we had not, because this was unanticipated funding that we would have for the MPO staff. We didn't have a designated program already in mind when the spending came on board. So we put it in this on-call services, which serves kind of as a holding place until we figure out what it is that we really want to do with this funding. So we may come back again at some point and ask for another revision if we determine that there's an opportunity to program these funds. So the only category that was really impacted is this past two long-range transportation planning because we reduced the transit governance study contribution by $1,174, and then we increased the on-call services by $47,319, which gives a net change in that line item of $46,145. So basically, we are asking you all to approve the revision to the EPW based on those funding changes, and that will be reflected in the revised document that we sent out for approval. Any questions on that?
Questions? All right, then you are looking for a motion on
We are
this.
looking
This
for a
is a
motion, yes.
request that we approve the proposed revisions to the fiscal year 23 PWP and the attached resolution is found in our packet. Second, any further discussion?
That you want second.
That was.
Thank you. Sure.
All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that is approved. Let's see. So all three bullet points. Sandy, you're still up, right?
I am still up. You're going to hear a lot from me tonight, probably. But congratulations, we are now long-range transportation planning for 2050. So I know this is the moment everybody's been waiting for. I know at the last meeting we talked a little bit about establishing a working group, and so I'm working with the localities to determine who those additional members of the working group need to be that will be giving out the documents from the MPO cycles. And then we also are in the process of procuring a consultant to support the LRTP. So we are still in process. But tonight, what we're going to talk about is our overall approach to the long-range transportation plan to get feedback from you all on what we're doing and hopefully build consensus and get support for moving forward with the process that we've been developing. Keep in mind, what was our question? Keep in mind that all of this is in draft form, so we're very receptive to any feedback that you have, but it will give us a starting place. And we have presented this at the MPO Tech and CTAC, and they've had some really good feedback for this as well. So first of all, for those of you that are new, I probably should have put this on the slide and I forgot to do so. But the reason we do a long range transportation plan is because we are federally mandated to do a long range transportation plan first and foremost. But more importantly than that, it does help us coordinate as a region and identify our regional priorities for how to invest limited resources into the most effective use and most effective improvement of the transportation program. We use a growth projection or a growth horizon, a planning horizon out to 2050. So it's considered a long range transportation plan. But really the really big emphasis that we're going to be focusing on as part of this is that we're going to develop a constrained budget for what we anticipate funding revenues to be over the next 5 years. And we will identify a short list of projects that we think need to be prioritized for funding within the next 5 years. We do these plans every 5 years to different extents. And so we'll have an opportunity to reevaluate in the next 5 years whether we have the same priorities or different priorities, or reestablish the list of projects that we want to make sure that we're pursuing. There are 3 standing committees. If you count the policy board as a committee, so there's a policy board and then 2 advisory committees. So, so each of them has a different designated role as part of this process. You all as a policy board are the steering committee. So ultimately you determine which projects need to be the priorities, what are the highest needs, and you're going to provide the general oversight and direction as to how we approach this planning process. You all are going to solely be responsible for approving the final elements. But there are 2 advisory committees that will support you. That's the MPO technical committee, which is mostly made up of the jurisdictional and state agency staff, as well as the departmental staff or the service providers like John's as well. So they are going to be providing sort of the staff level technical input, and the CTAC is the Citizen Transportation Advisory Committee. So they're going to help us develop our public participation strategies, help us make sure that we are considering how citizens are going to engage in this planning process, and also help be a conduit to bring citizen level recommendations into the planning process considerations. And then what you talked about last month was establishing this MPO tech work group. So transportation is important because it's taking you from one place to another place, or helping you connect different things that you need to do. So we thought it was going to be really important to make sure that this plan was connecting well with other planning initiatives that are happening in those of the localities. That includes things like the climate action goals that you all have all identified as priorities. Things like making sure that we are supporting inclusive outreach opportunities for the populations that have been designated as being required, but also making sure that those populations have the services that they need, coordinating with affordable housing planning, and also land use coordination. So this MPO tech, what I'm calling this MPO tech work group, will be the regular MPO tech committee, plus some of these other staff members at the state agency or local level that will be able to speak to some of these additional considerations and help us make sure that we're coordinating well with all these things. There we go. So this is our LRTP roadmap for 2050. So we're going to be working through each of these little pegs, and they'll help us kind of have an idea of where we are on our overall development of the long range transportation plan. In your packet, you have a Gantt chart. If you're like me, the Gantt chart may or may not be helpful to you. Gantt charts are not my favorite, but they're a good visual of how this is going to, how the schedule is going to work over those projects. We're going to have to get this plan approved by May of 2024. So we have almost 2 years to work through this. And so we wanted to be really thoughtful about how we're going to spread that work over that time period. So what I'm going to ask when we get done with this is if you have any feedback on the overall process, and then I'm going to ask you all to approve the general scope of work, knowing that some of the specifics within that Gantt chart might change. So let's just start going through the general process. These first 3 items, and these are generally going to follow the layout of the plan document itself. But these first 3 items are what I would classify as information gathering tasks. We're taking information that has already been developed and we're really trying to synthesize it. So we're going to be looking at demographic and land use trends. We're going to look at the existing system operations, and then we're going to be pulling in other plans and studies to help us understand how this long-range transportation plan is going to fit into all of the other planning efforts that have been going on in the intermediary between when the previous long-range transportation plan was developed and this long-range transportation plan. We're going to do as much of this upfront as possible, but we probably will be doing this on an ongoing basis, at least for the first several months of this project as information becomes available. The demographic analysis after conversation this afternoon, I think we're going to be using a 5-year American Community Survey estimates. The updated 2020 census data is not going to be available until the summer of 2023, and there are some concerns about the quality of the data given that it was taken during the COVID period. So we'll see what we are able to, we'll see what level we are able to get the data on for the 5-year ACS estimates, but we think that this is probably likely what we're going to use because we can go ahead and do that analysis now and start using it to inform the other aspects of the plan. Yes.
Sandy, have you looked at the Weldon Cooper data?
Yeah, the Weldon Cooper data, my understanding is that that's not going to be available at as great of a scale as we need it to be in order for it to be important. We're really looking for things at the block level or the block group level. And then we're going to work with the localities, with the different agencies, with the state, and other stakeholders to ensure that we have all the relevant plans available to forward. Any other questions on that? All right. Our next step is going to be to define our goals and objectives. So we can use the goals that were developed in 2045 as a baseline to help give us a starting point for what it is overall that we want to improve related to our transportation system. Based on some of the locally identified and the federally identified priorities, the recommendation that came from our staff and that also seemed to be confirmed with the MPO TAC and the CTAC meetings is that we probably want to do some recategorization of those 2045 baseline goals in order to better reflect those priorities. And then we'll go out to the public and do some substantive public engagement to inform the relative importance of those overall goals and objectives. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. The next step after we identify those goals and objectives is that we're going to take that information and then we're going to apply it to how the existing system is operating, and we're going to start prioritizing needs. So some of you may recall that we applied for a grant through the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment to do a growth and accessibility planning study to help us develop this prioritization process. So we've been working with them to identify the performance measures that we can use to evaluate the overall system and help us determine where the system operations are most efficient. So really we're looking at where is there congestion, where are there significant safety concerns, where is there a lack of accessibility, specifically accessibility to different roads for people from underserved communities, those kinds of things. And that's going to help us identify where the strongest needs are. From there, in a perfect world, prioritizing the needs would lead us to determine where we may need to do some additional studies or evaluation to determine what those improvements are. So after we get through this first cycle of doing the needs prioritization, that should help us inform where we would do additional studies to help us identify the most effective improvements that we want to pursue. And that will help create this kind of pipeline of identifying the problem, working to develop the solutions, and then prioritizing the solutions that we have developed. In this first round, though, because we have been so successful with getting our projects funded, we're probably not going to be able to apply that as fluently as maybe we would like to. But we do have a pretty significant list of projects that have already been developed, and there will be other projects that are going to be relatively straightforward that can resolve some of these high need areas. And so we're going to just kind of work through that as part of this first cycle, understanding that this is going to set up a process that will be able to hopefully move through a little bit more effectively once we get through this first sort of transition period. The recommendation that we discussed with the office is that we focus on first resolving existing system needs. There are a couple of different approaches. We could use the model, apply the growth projections using the model, and look at what is the system performance going to look like in our 2050 planning year horizon, and sort of prioritize our needs based on those future projections. But I think what we're really talking about is that running the model is pretty I guess, like cumbersome of a process, and it's not something that we can do in-house. And so this is also an opportunity for us to focus on where the most current existing needs are, knowing that those are probably going to be compounded in the future. And it just makes this a little bit more of an effective and efficient process to start with where we know the existing issues are. The other thing that this does is it allows us to consider when we are developing different solutions that could be applied to resolve these problems. It will allow us to then consider the future system performance when we are determining what is the right solution to enact at these high need areas. Does that make sense? Of us out there and give you all a chance to ask questions? Okay. Yes.
And you may want to come back to some of these later, and that's fine. So the needs you're going to start with are the ones on our interminable list from the current. And secondly, does your model that you're talking about take like impediment consideration in a serious way as we go forward?
Yeah, we'll talk about the performance that we wanted to make sure we're being really thoughtful about to include multimodal considerations. And then what I'm talking about prioritizing the needs is we're not talking about projects yet. We have a list of existing projects that we'll start pulling those into. The needs assessment is really just evaluating the performance of the system. And then what we will end up doing is we're going to overlay the projects that we've already identified against where the system needs are. And that will help us start talking about where do we need to start looking at which projects we want to move forward. Does that answer the question? All right, so then we'll move on to the project prioritization. So these are really two different steps. So we're looking at where are the biggest problems, then we're looking at how do we want to resolve some of these problems. So so like I said, the additional studies might be needed to help us explore what solutions might be in place, but some of them might also be really straightforward, where we know that there's a gap in the bicycle network that we want to fill, or maybe we need to do some operational improvements at an intersection or something like that. Some of these will be relatively straightforward. And so we'll start with the information that we already have or can be pretty easily developed. So as we evaluate the system needs, we're really looking at what can we measure on a system-wide level. So that's going to be things like congestion, that's going to be things like safety, and that's going to be things like accessibility indices. When we start talking about the project prioritization process, though, we can start pulling in some of these factors that are going to be a little bit more specific to the projects that are going to be able to be implemented. So that's when we're going to pull in some of these environmental considerations, like limiting the impacts on sensitive environmental and historic resources, coordinating with land use and economic development, and also coordinating with the system preservation factors. So looking at where there might be a deteriorating bridge or some sort of maintenance concern or something like that. And so if there's an opportunity to align a project where we know that there's already a need for some sort of significant maintenance or system preservation investment, that might be somewhere where we want to increase the priority of that project based on knowing that there's going to need to be some improvement there anyway. So the evaluation of the needs is at a system broad level, and then the project prioritization is going to start factoring some of these more locally specific information that's going to be pulled into the process. Any questions on that? Yes.
So the second bullet, the last one, coordination of landings, is that where the strategic plan impacts of the city and county and the comp plan elements would be there first
Mhm.
and then to the next?
Yeah, so we'll look at where do we expect there to be density, and maybe we want to prioritize improvements, especially multimodal improvements where we know there's been designated future growth, that kind of thing.
So those gaps in budget head or whatever it is would be higher priority than ones that were not in the chosen growth area, small area plan, something like that.
I believe so, yeah. That's the conversation I had this afternoon.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, if that's what you all want. I should say ultimately, you all are going to tell us if that's the direction you want to go. All right. So then after we go through that, we're going to have we're going to apply sort of this prioritization process to the needs. We're going to identify our potential projects. And that's going to help us get us to a point where we have a shorter list where we can start really pulling in like the costs and benefits and things like that, and start understanding how these fit in with the types of resources to fund these projects that we believe will be available. So this is where we get into developing our constrained budget, basically determining what funding programs are going to be available that make sense for each of these projects, and really sort of creating our short financially constrained list of prioritized projects. I'll also mention that one of the challenges with developing these implementation strategies is just that the funding environment has changed pretty significantly and is still changing in process. And then there are a lot of places that are really looking beyond the more traditional funding mechanisms in order to find other ways that they can implement some of these projects. So I think at least to start off with, we'll be really open about whether or not you all want us to consider, alternative implementation strategies, things like how to coordinate with private developers, or consider other opportunities to generate revenues beyond kind of the standard smart scale revenue sharing, transportation alternatives, kind of thing. So we'll have a conversation about that, but ultimately, this is really intended to give us a framework for what can we reasonably expect to implement over the next 5 years. And then the final step is going to be to finalize the priorities of the capital plan. Hopefully, if we do the rest of this well, that's going to be a relatively straightforward process by the time we get to that point, but I expect there will be lots of iterations of all of these steps along the way. So that's the general overview of the process. Any other questions or comments? All right.
I guess I have one. When you're looking at like the needs and talk about operational stuff, we're going to look at potentially what infrastructure is in place to help with technology to improve our system. I'm thinking like fiber where we have gaps in fiber that can connect to our signals, which would provide us a massive benefit as far as operations go.
So is that a system need, or would that maybe go along in the project prioritization once we identify like where the needs are? Maybe that goes into if there's already existing infrastructure to make some of those operations improvements we want to.
If it was there, I think we'd be doing it. I think the issue is there's gaps where we don't have or don't have access to.
Okay.
And maybe that's an overarching, a bigger question, but I know a big effort at the department is we're looking at where fiber is and using resource sharing agreements. Anytime anything goes in our right of way, we're getting fiber so that we can help with our smart operations to help the system move better.
Okay. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's a really good question to bring. That has not been on our radar so far.
Yes, Sean, follow-up question to that. So there are places where you need right of way, you need access to fiber that's already in the ground, that you need to legislative approval to get that?
No, if fiber is in the ground coming in new, we're generally getting a resource sharing agreement to tap into that fiber and get dedicated strength.
But pre-exist, that's what I'm asking.
If there's no agreement in place, then we have no rights to it.
But we could get that.
Yes, I just need to know, we need to know where.
We need to identify.
Yes, that was kind of the question. If we've got gaps, and I think as a department, we can easily identify where the gaps are at. We know where they're at. I just didn't know if, as through this process, where we want to try to,
bring that into the conversation.
because it helps, I mean, it helps a lot from somebody being able to sit in an operations center and change the timing of a signal, as opposed to having to call someone to go out to a signal, plug into it, to change your timing, to dial into it, through a modem. It's a big difference in how the system performs.
Yeah, I will say that previous plan, we talked about that goals in the book, I can remember down there. In the previous plan, we had more of these like operations and maintenance, but it wasn't really meaningfully informing the like project prioritization. So maybe, I mean, we can have a conversation about whether we need to add that back in. I guess one of my questions might be is as far as how we identify the types of projects that we're really prioritizing as an MPO, where would that fit into our overall sort of like funding request type of scenario?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it's more or less identifying where there's a need at to try to help facilitate.
Where the funding could potentially come from?
Yeah.
Okay. And it could be that maybe this doesn't get pulled into this prioritization process, but maybe it's just something that's discussed as an overall consideration that needs to be addressed outside of this actual project prioritization. Yeah, that's a good point.
This is a short range problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good feedback. Any other questions or comments? I do want to ask for a general vote on the overall scope and approach that we're taking. If you'd like me to, I can start going through some of the more specifics of what we've been doing so far, or if you feel like you have enough information to sort of make that overall determination that this feels like it's heading in the right direction overall, we can talk about the specifics afterwards.
But you're planning to present them today? Anyway.
Yeah, I have some more information I can go through if you'd like to do that first. Okay, sure. So the first thing we talked about was really defining, I don't want to say that these are our goals, but these are our overall goal categories that we're going to start with to start considering how important all of these different system factors are compared to one another. So the 2045 plan goals are listed here: accessibility and mobility, safety, economic development, land use, congestion, environment, community, operations, and maintenance. What we did is we went through this benchmarking exercise where we looked at our plan, we looked at some other plans, and then talking through looking at what some of these locally and federally identified priorities were. My suggestion is that we don't significantly change the 2045 plan goals, but we consider recategorizing them a little bit in order to better reflect sort of the direction that we've been going in since the last time was updated. So related to safety, again, these aren't sort of the final statements about what our goals are, but just to give us general categories that we think we need to make sure that we're addressing. The safety goals will look at both the vehicular safety, and then in order to also make sure that we are supporting some of those equity considerations, also pulling out safety for bicyclists and pedestrians separately. So there will be two different safety factors that are evaluated: vehicular safety, and then specifically roadway bike safety, or bike and pedestrian safety. The recommendation is that instead of lumping accessibility and mobility together, and then community and nature together, we pair equity and accessibility together to better reflect the sort of priority that we want to see a focus on these equity considerations, as well as also pull the environmental considerations out separately, since those have been identified as a very significant priority in our MPO areas. So for the equity and accessibility, we're really looking at improving access to jobs and activity centers for users by all modes. And then to capture that equity component, we're going to basically do an analysis of how many people have access by each of these modes of transportation to these defined activity centers. So we can talk about what constitutes an activity center, you know, when we get into more detail. But then to help us address that equity component, we'll also do a comparison against how many of the people in those areas that are representing underserved populations have access. So there's a weighting factor against what the disproportionate amount is for underserved communities to be able to access these jobs and activity centers compared to the general population. So that helps us capture that equity comparison that's been identified as a priority. After talking to MPO Tech, we pulled out the mobility and system efficiency separately. So if you recall in 2045, this was really just called congestion, and it was really about minimizing or reducing congestion. The MPO Tech conversation pointed us in the direction where it really wasn't the congestion relief that was really all that substance. So there's a lot of congestion. It feels like we have limited opportunities to address it, but really our priorities are trying to encourage people to use different modes of transportation, not necessarily expanding the capacity of existing roads, although I think we still want to look at where we can make operation improvements where we can. But we don't want to go into this plan assuming we're going to build a lot of roadway infrastructure necessarily. We really want to encourage the shift to other modes whenever it's feasible. And so this is really looking at increasing the system efficiency. So how can we make those intersection operations improvements where we use the intelligent transportation systems, things like that to improve operations and then also increase the system reliability. Coordination with economic development, land use, that's really just about making sure that we have some sort of consideration for where the transportation infrastructure is going, related to where the population growth and economic development areas have been indicated. And then as far as the environment, we're still working on how to measure some of these. Some of these are a little bit easier to manage than the other. The smart scale approaches, once we have identified improvement, is there any sort of environmental, historic, or culturally significant asset within a specified buffer of that area? That's really straightforward to measure. It's really simple to implement. We do really want to make sure that we are speaking to the climate action goals, though, and the emissions reduction goals that have been identified as a high priority in those localities. So we're still working out the methodology to do that, but we're going to find some ways to incorporate that. And then we also want to make sure that we're committing sustainable transportation improvements. So looking at what kinds of resiliency considerations can we make sure that we are bringing into any improvements that are considered. And then the system preservation has really been identified as maybe a coordination factor. So it's not necessarily going to be used to score a project, but it might be used to give a project a little bit of a higher prioritization if there's an identified system preservation need for that stuff. Any feedback on the goals? Anything that you would like to see like revised or changed or added or that we didn't capture?
I have a really basic question. I'm sorry to ask one this basic. The system you're referring to presumably is the network of roads and traffic signalization, bridges, and is it these the VDOT run roads and so forth? It would include like city streets or
it will include all publicly owned roads.
okay.
So it will include the city as well.
Okay, so the city's portion of taking care of our business is like underneath this.
Yeah. Yeah. So really what happens with the short list, I'm just not another one talking there, or another one that came around top of it. Okay. Really what this project prioritizations really are used for is to support applications for funding projects. So the city's projects that they'll want to be able to apply for funding for through any of these federal programs or state programs need to be identified during this process.
Okay.
If that's helpful.
And that's a conversation that happens with Rick Duncan and you all in terms of how that makes it on the list.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, it will be identified through the same process. But if there are things that aren't identified on this process that are a high priority, that's a conversation we'll need to have. But ultimately, you all are going to approve the projects that show up on this list. And I will say that we have the city of Charlottesville as well as the county of Albemarle have staff that have been participating in developing these measures through the OIP grant process. They have been pretty closely integrated, and we're trying to make sure that we're working pretty closely so that everybody understands and buys into the process that we're using to develop all the regional priorities.
Okay.
I'm full of out of time questions. I don't know how granular you are yet, but in order for prioritization to be used, we need pretty specific stuff in here. So you're going to be getting to that more specific information before we begin to put projects in.
Yeah, so the way this is going to work is we'll prioritize the system needs. Then we'll go back and look at what are the projects that we already have identified, either maybe they're through the vision plan that we've already developed and we have some baseline information that we can pull into that, or there's a relatively straightforward way to address the problem, or there's another study that's been completed since the last 2045 plan that we can apply. There's been some of these VDOT pipeline studies and kinds of things. So we'll start there. And then, like I said, what's going to happen is there might be a really high need that's identified because maybe we resolved all the high needs that were identified before we're doing this well. So there might be a really high need that we identify that we don't really have a great solution for. And so that's going to point us in the direction of saying we really need to do something. We don't know what to do. We need to do a study.
You have like a scoring mechanism, like you give points based on some criteria, or is this kind of?
Yeah, we're working on developing that. That's what we're doing.
You don't have that now.
No, we don't have that in place just yet. That's under development. I also want to emphasize though that really just gives us a starting point to have the conversation, because ultimately we'll come back to you all and say, there might be projects that, score really high based on this analysis, but just for whatever reason, that doesn't make a lot of sense to really move forward with. So that gives us a starting place to have the conversation. But, that doesn't mean that has to be the projects that are determined through this process.
And somewhere along the line, you'll need to resolve the challenge always about, are we talking about throughput stuff, or are we talking about city street, walkable, context sensitive stuff? So that will have to happen before you put your projects in. Yes.
Yeah, and what we're going to do is we're going to take these general goal categories, and one of the first things we're going to do is go out to the public and say, how important are these goals compared to each other? I don't know how exactly we're going to ask that question, but that's really the goal of the public participation, is to help inform us, and then come back to you and say, based on the public impact, this is what we're hearing about the relative importance of each of these goals. What kind of weight should we give to this kind of project or this kind of need over another kind of project or another kind of need? And so you'll be able to say, you know what, we really only want to consider congestion at like 10% of what we consider the rest of this. And we really think that safety needs to be 30% of the conversation, or whatever your values are. You'll be informing the relative importance of each of these based on the public feedback.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments or feedback about these overall categories? All right, so get in a little bit more details. I wasn't planning on going into this in a lot of detail, but if you have questions, I'm certainly happy to tell you as much as I know. So far through working with the consultants with the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, we've really been focusing on identifying the priority needs and how we're going to measure those. We are just now starting to move forward towards the project prioritization metrics that we're going to use. So those aren't as well determined right now. So there were a couple of things that I just want you all to know when we started this process with the OIP consultants, and that's that they have some guidelines or a framework for what they base the development of this process on. The first is that they want to use publicly available data, or data that's specific to the MPO, because what they're trying to do is build their capacity to help other MPOs and other localities with this planning process. So anything that they do, they want to make sure other areas or other localities or other MPOs would potentially be able to do something similar. The very first thing they did with us was go through an internal capacity evaluation, and so they're basing the methodology on the existing staff and technology that's available to us and based on what our skills and abilities are. And then there's a really strong focus on developing a process and how to implement it. So while they will use the data that they're pulling and developing to help us understand what, putting this information together, what kind of outputs are going to be, this is really going to be something that potentially could be replicable in future plans. So it's helping us develop an overall process that we can use and adjust as needed in future plans.
So it's really just a framework.
Mhm. It's a framework and a tool. They're going to give us a tool, and they're going to tell us where to get the data. Yeah. All right. So talking about the needs prioritization, I don't necessarily need to get into specifics with this, but they're using the potential for safety improvements, which is basically something that's developed through a statewide safety action plan. Yeah. So they're pulling that information from VDOT. We'll identify the top segments and intersections in both Charlottesville and Albemarle separately, and then we'll combine all of those. There's been some discussion about whether we actually want to weight those by the equivalent property damage only. So basically, this would provide like crashes where there's a serious injury or a fatality will be scored much higher than crashes that have a minor injury or are property damage only as an equivalency. There's some discussion about whether or not that actually gives you an accurate idea where the severity is. If there's even one fatality, that's going to make that one location a really, really high priority, and that may not really inform the overall severity of how dangerous the intersection is, because that fatality is kind of a outlier from the normal. So there's some discussion about that, but we'll have it weighted somehow to measure the severity and frequency of crashes, those intersections. And then they're developing a kind of technical process to evaluate whether bicycle and pedestrian crash hotspots, but basically identifying where are there places where there's a high concentration of bicycle and pedestrian involved crashes within a closely defined geographic area. So we'll evaluate safety from both the sort of motor vehicle side and the bicycle and pedestrian crash side. Equity and accessibility, they are using National Accessibility Evaluation Data Set, which evaluates access to jobs and activity centers. And so, like I said earlier, it's basically going to go through this process where it identifies the number of workers who can reach an activity center within a designated time period by the different nodes. So as many people can walk to a specified activity center in 45 minutes, as many people can get there by transit, as many people can get there by bicycle, etc. And then they're going to weight that against the total number of workers with access by the population of specific workers in each block. So that gives us that accessibility or that equity consideration, so we can sort of determine not just who has access, but what kind of equity consideration do we need to give to where there might be an equity concern that we want to prioritize. And then the mobility is kind of a combination of a couple of different ones. So there's the travel time index, which is basically the ratio of how much longer it takes you to get to a destination during rush hour compared to how long it takes you to get there when there's no rush hour. Travel time reliability, which is basically saying if it's really, really important for me to be at work 95% of the time, this is the amount of buffer time I need to give myself to get there. And then there's the level of travel time reliability, which is basically saying this is what percentage of the time it takes me longer, a really long time compared to the average amount of time in freezing conditions to get to my destination point. So that's really measuring the congestion system reliability types of considerations. So those are the three factors that we're going to be using, or that it's recommended to use to really identify where there are deficiencies in the system. And then when we start talking about the prioritization, we'll be able to use some of those same types of considerations to say, like, this is how significant the need is. Let's evaluate this based on you know, what our priorities are for selecting projects. You know, there's a high congestion need, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to build more capacity. It could be that we want to expand multimodal facilities in that place or something like that. So we're going to work on how to translate some of this into our project prioritization, but we haven't gotten there yet. And then that's when we'll also bring in the economic development, land use coordination, the environmental consideration, the system preservation considerations. Any questions on this? I think this is one of those things that will probably start being a lot more meaningful when we see it applied to the process. All right. So the performance measures that we've been talking about with the project prioritization as using current zoning and future land use designations. So there will be a higher priority for projects that support land use goals for things like mixed use or designated growth areas and things like that. The environmental factors. Any other questions or comments? This is something we'll try to work pretty closely with the MPO tech to, you know, get more into the details and bring back to you. But as we were kind of a little bit more. But that's the general overview.
So one comment I have, the MPO tech work group. So several times peppered throughout here is economic development and land use. But in your work group, you just have land use first. So I would recommend
Economic development.
add economic development staff in the jurisdictions. If you just go with community development, we find this in our own house. If you just talk community development, you do not necessarily get the economic development piece of your way.
That's a good suggestion. Yeah. And I think other questions.
Would be like a sort of interactive, clickable sort of document that tracks this over time. You update it every 5 years, is that the idea?
Yeah, it's similar to localities' requirements for their comprehensive plans where it has to be reviewed every 5 years. The extent of what changes in the 5 years can vary a little bit. I think.
You're talking about 2050, which is 27 years from now, but is this really like sort of a rolling 5-year plan to get to 2050?
Yeah, and that's because we want to consider, you know, any improvements now that we have to define this plan is going to take us 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get funded, and then it's going to take another 4, 5, 6 years before those projects start being implemented. So we do need to sort of plan for the, you know, consider the existing needs, but also make sure that any improvements that we end up implementing consider what the future impacts are going to, or what the future environment of that system is going to be at that location. The clickable plan is a good idea. I don't know, maybe part of this is coming up with some sort of dashboard or, you know, interactive process to track it.
I don't know how often you would be updating that, so that's like a couple times a year. Or what does that take?
Well, it really depends on how effective we are at identifying projects that get funded. So really, there's not necessarily going to be a lot to update the plan until we start implementing some of the high priority projects. I would say.
I like all the measures and the things you were just describing in terms of conceptually how you're going to. I guess that will be fleshed out over the course of the next 6 months or so. Or?
Yeah, well, the state, most of this information comes from the state, and so I can't speak to how often V-Trans is updated. I think it's updated at least every 2 years. I don't know, Sean, if you know that off the top of your head.
Different aspects of some of the data that you're talking about comes up on an annual basis.
Yeah.
Some of the goals can be a little longer than in 2 years. But
I see.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'll learn a lot through this process, I'm sure. Any other questions? Do you all want me to talk about the general public participation plan draft? first, or do you want to give me any other feedback about the overall scope and approach?
Say that again.
Well, so one of the things we're trying to do tonight is to give you a chance to just vote and hopefully in confirmation or with any specified changes that you'd like to see to the scope. But I can certainly go through the draft public engagement plan, just knowing that that is also subject to change once we get consultants on board to help us sort of develop those strategies.
Yeah, why don't you go through?
Go through it. Okay. All right. So again, we'll use consultants pretty significantly to help us inform the process, but I want to make sure that it's really clear that our staff is planning to really be the ones doing all of the engagement. And so the consultants are really acting to give us advice and feedback and tell us what has worked or what has been effective to help guide us, but this will all be implemented by our existing staff. The overall goals for our public engagement related to this plan is, first of all, we want to make sure that we're complying with all of the required public engagement programs that have been identified. So that includes our Title VI, which is making sure that we're reaching out to Lucinda, who are our Title VI communities, limited English speaking, low income minorities. That's it, okay. And then making sure that we are also complying with our own locally adopted public engagement plan for MPO. And then because so much of this plan does have these really technical components, we also want to be really thoughtful that we are asking for public engagement at points in this planning process that are going to be able to be meaningfully informed by those who participate. And then we want to make sure that we're using a variety of formats to reach as broad of a spectrum as people as possible. So again, this is just a draft at this point with some additional thoughts, but there will need to be a project website that will be established, and that will sort of be a clearinghouse for all of the information related to this plan. So we'll have all of our meeting schedules, summaries, and meeting minutes as appropriate, depending on the nature of the meeting, any maps that we develop, any surveys that are going to be available for the public, and then any draft materials that have been developed as part of this process. So there could be some technical amendments that are developed that explain methodology or summarize the project prioritization process, things like that. So all of the information will be developed on that project website. Really, we see, or I guess I should say, I don't want to implicate anybody else besides myself. Really like 4 key points where it would make sense to really do some really substantive public outreach. So the first is in the goal setting phase. This gives us an opportunity to introduce the project to the public. It will give the public an opportunity to help inform the relative importance of the goals and objectives compared to each other. And this helps us also build some excitement around the plan that can help inform, that can help bring people into participation in the rest of the plan as well. So at this point, we would want to include some sort of survey, probably both online and in paper, an open house or an in-person opportunity for people to learn more about this, as well as an online webinar. And then also really working to identify some of these community intercept opportunities. So that's where we're going to the farmers markets or the festivals or those kinds of places to try to make sure that people are aware of this and have heard about, or know that this is happening and have an opportunity to have some really simple opportunities for them to inform the process that isn't going to be, too time expensive if we're catching somebody at one of these events. The feedback we got from the Citizens Transportation Advisory Committee was really helpful. They felt like it would be really beneficial to have a really clear, why should the average person care about this project kind of statement to help people understand why it's important that they participate. And also making sure that all of the information that we develop and the ways that we ask for feedback isn't so technical that it's off-putting for somebody who would like to engage. So I think we have some really good feedback that we're going to work to incorporate. And I was very appreciative of that. So based on all of this goal setting work that we do up front, We will then take all of this back and we'll input it into sort of this prioritization weighting system that we're developing with the consultants. And that will give us a first draft of identifying where the priorities are. So I think we will probably want to do some review of that by our technical committee and that MPO tech working group to really look at, are there any gaps based on sort of just their understanding of where the needs are in the community that will help us use what I don't really like the sort of ground truth, whether or not the process that we use actually captures all of the needs that they are aware of. So it's really important to have that diverse stakeholder group. And then we can put that out to the public comment for them to provide feedback on. And what will likely happen is that there will be other things that the public comments on that are not identified as part of just running this prioritization process. So we'll be able to take that summary of public feedback and bring it back to you. And hopefully we'll be able to build consensus around sort of where we believe the highest needs are. Then the next step is going to be that project prioritization. So after we identify those needs, we'll look at the identified improvements that we have available to apply to those high need areas. We'll be able to go through a project ranking process relative to the project cost. We can start running these scenarios through the travel demand model to estimate what the potential impacts could be from the different types of projects. And then we can take all that information out to the public again and say, based on what we've heard, these are some of the recommendations that we think will be most effective at resolving the highest needs on our transportation system. Tell us what you think. And we'll do another kind of large push for public engagement during that phase. And then we'll bring all that back to you, and then you'll help inform us on, you know, how we you know, select the projects from that list. Maybe we remove some, maybe we add some. You know, we'll start refining the projects from there. But we'll work through that process, and then by the time we get to the final plan, hopefully we've had really good conversations and built consensus at these other three phases. That when we get to the final plan, we'll have the public hearing, but there won't be any more substantive revisions at that point. So, any other feedback or questions? Or again, this is in draft form, so I'm very open to any suggestions you have on changes.
This is a real nerdy point. I didn't see any mention of environmental justice, EJ populations. I think that executive order is still in effect. Are you going to be, is that a group that we should be concerned about within this context, or is that more project related? Or?
I'm hoping that we're capturing that and the other equity analysis that we're doing. But you're right, but that's part, I believe that's part of the Title VI report.
No, it's not. The Title VI is not the overall populations. It's separate.
I see.
They're related,
Yeah.
certainly, but the EJ and low income people have usually gotten runs a bad decision on transportation projects. So it's really particularly relevant
Sure.
to be considering those factors. This is a food for thought.
Yeah, I think that is part of at least the accessibility analysis, but at the end of this, what we will need to do is we'll need to sort of do a review of these are the projects we identified and kind of overlay those against the populations, you know, or something like that, just to help us give us a double check on, are we?
It could almost be part of your environmental scheme too.
Sure.
It could be a fatal flaw issue. So
Yeah,
whatever you want to do, but this is one thing that stood out.
no, that is really helpful. One, I hope the consultants will be able to make sure that we consider that space so that we need to. And two, I think we have identified that we need to make sure that we're including the county and the city's diversity, equity, and inclusion staff as part of this process. So
EJ is also income related, so it's not necessarily persons with
Sure.
color or that kind of thing. It's people who are below the poverty level, those kind of things, which have been sometimes been victimized by.
Sure. Yeah, understood. And in my mind, it was incorporated in Title VI. So I think in my mind, I thought that was already.
Yeah, those are two separate things.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification.
So one recommendation, so the long-range transportation plan, in Albemarle, we have citizen advisory committees that meet monthly. Boards, the planning commissioners serve as liaisons to those boards. Typically, each one of those CACs have their own hot list of items that review. And obviously, transportation is always a big point. I would think, I don't know if Supervisor Malley would agree or not, but I would think that that's a great place in public outreach where when you talked about, we'll go to pop-ups or we'll go to trying to get input, these are citizens that are really engaged month in, month out on what the pressing issues that define their area is. Like Mr. Condor's on my Prioritization CAC, he's on CJ. They could be a great place where you go get some elevated, localized information from a community that I think could inform the bigger system. And then they will in turn go out and help advertise and push public engagement to whatever other mediums you're going to meet. I don't know if there are things like that in the city, but if there are, I would recommend, I think it would be worthwhile for us to take the time to maybe even do a staff presentation or something just to each of those bodies, or maybe we could combine a couple, like I can get Supervisor McKeel's CAC together with mine and we could do one hit. But I think you could get some really good feedback at the goal setting level and at the project prioritization level with those groups, just because they're so engaged on a month-to-month basis.
I would agree. I think there's 3 times the number of people present beyond the members of the committee too. So it's usually a very large audience. That would be helpful.
And these are places now where developers are bringing to satisfy their, if they're going to rezoning, they need to have a community meeting. They're now going to these CACs to help set. So you do get good attention to these. So it could be a worthwhile use of time from a public agency.
And we have committees like that, right? In terms of various boards and commissions, like that committee.
Mr. Breeze just walked out, but maybe it can work. I'm trying to cover this opportunity.
Kevin, he's been subjected to these CACs. So I think he would agree that these are folks that Pepper do with questions about transportation, how does this get determined, what is the priority list? So these are folks that are going to have a little bit different level of understanding, and they have, all these folks on my CAC have started to ask, how does the long-term vision come to be? So just you probably have to do a little education about the plan, which I would imagine is part of your public engagement anyway. Like, why should this matter to me?
Right.
But those I think could be really, you could get high bang for your buck or return for your time engaging those particular committees, and you can assist with them.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
And I think they're very receptive to homework.
Okay.
So that's sort of heavy text stuff and the backgrounds, all those things that can be supplied ahead of time. People will come in the door much more prepared than just, then you won't have to do absolutely everything down to the end. There will certainly be people who need explanations about things, but I think others also appreciate a little more background than just the meeting.
Sure.
So you're going to the public for goal setting. I mean, I guess it sounds like you're going to accept comment on the needs prioritization, or are you going to do an active push out in each one of those sections?
I think the goal setting, what I hope is that at the goal setting, we'll be able to really start building a contact list and then develop a communications plan. And so at the needs identification or the needs prioritization, not necessarily, I don't know that we necessarily need to go back out to the public at that point, but we can certainly make sure that we are communicating with the people that we have established communications with proactively, that the needs have been identified, and have like an open comment period for people to comment. But again, this is really just in draft form, so I'm really open to hearing if you think there should be a greater push at some of these points.
I think it makes sense to say, let's hear what you have to say about what the goals should be for this plan. There's some analysis done, and then here's what, now put some input on what you think the prioritization, because then they can react to the needs prioritization. So that works. What's the total? Couldn't figure it out on this graph that was in the packet. The total time frame from start to finish for the public engagement period.
Yeah,
She's like goal setting, when does that roll out?
the goal setting I have rolling out on, we might have to adjust the time a little bit because it's the winter, but in January. So, and it would last at least like a big push for about 2 months. And again, this is draft, so if we find out we get to the end of 2 months and we haven't gotten what we hope to, we can certainly adjust that a little bit.
Project prioritization would be 6 months down the road.
The project prioritization would be about in June of next year. Yeah.
Any other comments and questions? So you're at the point where you'd like us to sign off and saying, yeah, good plan.
Yep, good plan. Let's see how it goes. Yeah.
You want an official vote or is consensus fine? All right, so we would need a motion to endorse this approach. Is that a fair statement?
I'm going to endorse the approach.
I'll second that. Further discussion? All right, all in favor, say aye. Opposed?
Thank you.
So from our part, would it be fair to direct maybe the staff conversation about direct any of that CAC coordination to you? See how it goes. And that was it on the part. All right, so we'll move to item 6, staff updates. The first bullet, safe streets and roads for all grant applications. Sandy, you're still up.
Yeah, I'll keep this pretty short, since I think most of you have some awareness of it, but the Safe Streets and Roads for All discretionary grant program was established in bipartisan infrastructure law. Establishes between $5 and $6 billion in the next 5 years to fund projects with the goal of preventing roadway deaths and serious injuries. There are 2 types of grants that we can apply for through this discretionary grant program. The first is a planning grant to develop a comprehensive safety action plan. And then the second would be implementation to implement some of the strategies that are identified in a qualifying comprehensive safety action plan. None of the localities within the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission region have a qualified comprehensive safety action plan in place. So we have developed a multi-jurisdictional application to develop that over the next 2 years if we are awarded. Based on the Safe Streets and Roads for All discretionary grant program guidelines, there are 8 components that are required for a safety action plan to comply with the qualifying criteria. There has to be a leadership commitment from the local governing board, basically saying that we want to adopt really substantive goals towards reducing and eliminating roadway deaths and serious injuries. There has to be ongoing oversight and implementation and monitoring of the implementation of the strategies identified in the plan. It involves a comprehensive safety data analysis, substantive public engagement. There are equity considerations, so we need to make sure that we develop a plan using inclusive and representative processes. And then there has to be an evaluation and prioritization of not just improvement projects, not just on the ground, like the infrastructure improvement projects, but also looking at the processes and policies that are in place. So things like, how do we enforce traffic regulations, and are there design guidelines and things like that that we also need to consider that might also contribute to some of the safety outcomes, those kinds of things. And then basically you have to do a comprehensive prioritization of all the strategies that are identified as part of that safety action plan development. And then there has to be ongoing monitoring and reporting on the outcomes from the implementation after that safety action plan is adopted. So these are just some of the benefits that we identified that are part of that the comprehensive safety action plan would help us fulfill. First of all, we are going to be collecting data system-wide for all of the crash locations that will help us really understand what is contributing to serious crashes throughout the region. The kind of standard process that we go through with these corridor studies or small area plans is really looking at a really location-specific needs and improvements. And so this is going to help us identify those recurring and systemic issues that are contributing to crashes. We consider safety for all users, so roadway, bike ped, transit users, and it also considers safety for users of all road types. So this would also include private roads, not just publicly owned roads. There are a lot of opportunities for us to build relationships among stakeholders that are not always engaged in this planning process. So part of this is that we want to start working with like law enforcement, with public safety personnel, those kind of things, the health department, maybe the Department of Motor Vehicles. So it gives us a chance to bring all of these stakeholders together in one place to start some larger conversations around safety. Helps us approach safety from multiple perspectives. So not just, like I said, not just on the ground improvements, but also looking at how can we do better public education, or how can we consider how the policies that we have adopted in a region might be contributing to the safety outcomes that we're seeing. And then it also creates a pipeline of identified projects that we can potentially use to apply for funding through some of these existing programs or new programs. Once we have the safety action plan in place, localities will be eligible to then apply for implementation funding for some of these identified projects. So it gives you a new revenue stream, but it also helps us identify projects that may be appropriate for other funding opportunities that you are already taking advantage of, like revenue sharing or transportation alternatives. So the final application that we submitted was supported by all 6 jurisdictions in the region. The total grant amount requested was just under $1.1 million. Nearly half of that is designated, or we expect will go towards public engagement. It's still in draft form, but that was the tentative scope. We have reached out to VDOT, to the Highway Safety Improvement Program Coordinator, and VDOT is going to provide a lot of the background data collection and crash analysis. So this part is going to be done regardless of whether we are successful in receiving the grant. So we're really looking forward to being able to provide that level of information to all of the localities in our region. The TJPDC will administer the grant, and then we will also provide ongoing monitoring and reporting through our existing programming. So through the MPO and the Rural Transportation Program, we'll make sure that localities are able to meet that requirement through us and don't have to assume an additional requirement to collect that information. The regional approach to data collection and analysis is supported by VDOT, and then each locality is going to basically have their own defined set of safety action plan priorities and strategies based on this. So we'll get the returns to scale of doing all of these on the regional level, but each locality will have individually identified priorities that will come out of this plan. Any questions on this?
So we said it would scrutinize the enforcement. So is that part of the data analysis? That we go and actually see how they're.
It could be. I mean, I don't want to presume that any of this will or will not rise to the level. I think enforcement might be one of the strategies. I don't know if there's data around enforcement that will help us understand sort of the safety aspects.
Interesting. I mentioned my CACs. This conversation just came up at my last CAC was last week. When you talked about public education, the citizens were talking about how roundabouts are becoming more. We were using roundabouts more. A public awareness or public education program of how to approach a roundabout as a driver, not familiar with before. As we started to see, like we had one project, there's some green tea in Belvedere and Rhino Road. Well, we don't have any green tea, so that is, it's just interesting that sounds like that could come out of this. We have programs that say, yeah, we're new road treatments that are helping with flow and or safety. Here's how you educate people.
Sure.
Even flashing yellow arrows, you'd be surprised how many people don't know what flashing yellow arrow is.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I mean, one thing that would be important is, I mean, so many opportunities we look at it, where everybody wants to go around that, but there not always the best thing for pedestrians and bikes. So, you know, we're gonna educate on, you know, what might make roadway improve, we should also consider the whole population. They have to be designed very carefully.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think that's why the public engagement is so important, to make sure that we're really doing that well, to make sure all those populations are engaged and understand what those potential implications will be for them, especially around a university. That is really important.
Interestingly enough, Stanford's doing its own one right now. And they had kind of I won't call it ring road, it's not really that, but they have sort of an outside loop. And they did, on that, they did one roundabout. And their president got really excited. And now they're putting in about the sixth one. You know, so all of a sudden just funding came flying through for them to, of course, it's a private university, so they fund things in a different way than we do. But, you know, in the right context, they can be very successful. It's also extremely flat. And that's another thing that we deal with when thinking about roundabouts. All the green change. So, I think where we have, there will be, yeah.
We can all keep our fingers crossed. We don't actually know when we'll hear about this. I forget what the exact language is.
They will let people know as expeditiously and flexibly as possible. So we hope to hear expeditiously.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Any other questions or comments for this one? We all done? Is that it?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so that will get some transit, and RTP. Shannon?
Thanks for allowing me time tonight. We have two transit studies that we're currently working on. The first one is the vision study, which we're starting to wrap up. We're working on the final report. We closed the public engagement period weeks ago, and I was really happy with our results from the last survey. We had over 50% were minorities and over 50% were lower income. So that was really satisfying for us. And the vision study will be presented, the final draft of it will be presented to the RTT meeting on October 27th. If anybody wants to come check it out. The consultants will be there. And then the governance study has just started up. We're recruiting a steering committee, which will be 2 representatives from each jurisdiction. One will be an elected official and one will be a staff member. And we're also looking to have a staff representative from Albemarle and Charlottesville, because they funded the project and want to make sure that they are getting what they need out of the project. So the kickoff meeting will be in October. And that's all I have.
Very good. Questions on that? And then the next update is on ride share. Everything's online, correct?
Yes, I'm here. So I just have a couple of quick updates for rideshare. We are participating in the statewide initiative through DRPT with Discover Transit, mostly promoting the Afton Express, which helps ferry commuters over from the Shenandoah Valley to the Charlottesville, Albemarle area on 4 morning routes and 4 evening routes. It also happened to coincide with the 1-year anniversary of the launch of the Afton Express. So that service began officially on September 1. So we have been promoting Discover Transit as well as celebrating that particular milestone all month. We've had a few different outreach opportunities, both at UVA and at some of the stops across the mountain. And we'll be having our final celebration tomorrow morning at the Waynesboro Park and Ride lot with a radio remote with some breakfast and coffee and some giveaways and information. So we certainly welcome any of our funding partners or any of the public to come and visit us tomorrow morning from 6 to 10 at the Waynesboro Park and Ride lot. Looking forward, as we're closing out the month of September and moving into October, also with DRPT, we will be promoting Rideshare Month through the month of October. We have always done either a rideshare week or rideshare month promotion, but this year it is going as a statewide initiative as well. So we will be promoting the benefits of carpooling and van pooling, listing what those opportunities are, as well as promoting our ride matching system that also offers rewards for those who log trips as well. And of course, always promoting guaranteed ride home as one of the best advantages to taking alternative transportation in the area. So that's pretty much all we've got going on with rideshare. It's been a busy couple of fall months. So it's always nice to get out when the weather is lovely to promote all of these things.
Questions there? Okay. So that'll take us to number 7, our roundtable updates. I'll go through the non-voting members first, and then we'll move through the voting members, if that's all right. Let's go through the order I have in front of you, Mr. Reed. You got to start. Thanks from John.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. We're almost finishing up our alternative fuel study. We're trying to determine what kind of propulsion mechanism for our vehicles. We're looking at hydrogen fuel cells, electric, and CNG. We have an advisory committee of community stakeholders, including the chamber and environmental groups, to help us sort through all that. And we expect to do some recommendations in November with a presentation to our board in December. Also, we're actually starting our FY24 budgeting process. We have some funding challenges as it relates to federal funding. We operate both in the urban and rural area, and we don't have sufficient urban funding from the federal government to meet capital needs or operating needs. That may put pressure on our local funding partners in terms of addressing that. But we'll be discussing that more with our board and our funding partners in the coming weeks. So, thank you, sir.
PBA.
I think the only thing I might mention is, I think people are aware that we're starting to bring on board battery-powered buses. So we'll be getting our first delivery of 4 buses next summer. And then the following summer, we'll be getting 4 more. So we're just slowly converting the fleet over. But there's a lot of changes that need to be made to support the different technologies. So we're studying that currently for the Melmont site, which is where parking and transportation near Barracks Road. We have a study underway to see what we need to do immediately to prepare for next summer, and then what we need to do for the next summer after that, and then when we need to do the larger conversions. So that's a very technical and interesting process underway. And we, for a period of time, we have to have both systems, both fueling systems, the duality behind it, and figure out how to make it all work on the same site, which is quite the jigsaw puzzle. So,
Do you have any space on your rooftops to run solar for your charging station at the Belmont Transpo site? Because isn't it a flat roof?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you should ask about this, because I just got out of a meeting where we're talking about, we already have solar on a number of our roofs, but we want to keep pushing that. And so right now, for us to do roof by roof is super expensive. So we're trying to put together a power purchase agreement where we can bulk process rooftops. And so we're just in that process now where we're trying to get the vendor set up for the PPA, and then figure out all the configuration and how much power that will generate. So it's actually a much larger effort, that we're going to really try to make better usage of our roofs in general. So, us fingers.
Thank you. Mr. Williams and Kat, see you're online.
Awesome.
Technical difficulties. So a couple of things just want to bring to everyone's attention. One, we are halfway through our feasibility study also for alternative fuel. We will be setting up some bi-weekly meetings starting probably next week to complete the second round, which we are doing more engagement with the fuel providers, the electricity providers, Dominion and others. We're also looking at potentially adding CNG vehicles into the mix. Our initial study looks at how many EV vehicles can we add to the fleet. That's part of our study. So we already make the assumption that we're going to add some level of EV to our fleet makeup. At some point in time, we need to figure out what makes sense now and then in the future. As the technology gets better, of course, we'll be able to add more infrastructure around the city and the county, and then eventually build out our EV model more aggressively. Final thing that I kind of want to bring everybody's attention to is we are required to do a transit strategic plan. It's different this year than our normal TDP. Council has before them at the next council meeting on the 3rd, an ordinance that we put in to supply the money for that. After that, we'll be going out for an RFP to hire a consultant to complete the required transit strategic plan by December 31st of 2023. That's all I have.
Thank you, sir. Questions? Mr. Condor, any updates from CTAC?
No, not at this time. We're following the long-range transportation plan activity very closely and hope to assist in that.
Thank you, sir. I see Mr. Proctor there. I'm going to go to Mr. Barnes first, and you guys can jump if you both want to talk. Obviously, you do that.
So I would just say that we are wrapping up the validation period for smart scale applications that have been live with Albemarle County as well as the MPO. So a total of 12 projects between those organizations. The validation period, like I said, we're sort of wrapping up the information that be a part of the application. We hope to get the estimates for the projects the next week or so. Back to staffs. And then we'll go through a more scoring process to wrap up towards the end of the year, and we'll know who's successful towards next year. That's a big push for the one.
Mr. Proctor, you want any updates from your side as well?
No, Michael pretty much covered everything that we needed to say.
Thank you, sir. Let's see. Mr. Garment, do you have anything about more you'd like to?
I'll share a couple quick things. So for one, we are preparing a submission for a Reconnecting Communities grant that's going to evaluate the 29 corridor from essentially a hydraulic road up to Rivanna River. Purpose of the planning grant that we're submitting for is to look at a way to reduce Route 29 as a barrier across it. So it's going to be evaluating multimodal transportation, both parallel and perpendicular to the route. We have been in discussions with the city, Mr. Frias, because some of those connections would obviously be made to Charlottesville, south of Greenbrier on that one side. And then if anyone is not aware yet, we did receive the successful funding for the RAISE grant for the 3-notch trail in Albemarle County, a little over $2 million to identify the alignment and some conceptual designs and priorities from Afton, the Afton Tunnel up in Nelson County, all the way through Albemarle County to the City of Charlottesville. So those are the big planning things, and Mike mentioned the 12 smart scale projects that we're still working on.
Christine, any updates from your seat?
Not beyond what we already have.
Give it a shot.
I will say this, we have several interviews this week and next week for the transportation planner. So we are very hopeful that this round will get us what we need.
All right, we'll go through the voting numbers real fast. I'll start with Mr. Nelson and Salisbury. Updates?
So I don't know if you all saw, we had the detour set up for the 251 roundabout, build that roundabout out at 1/2. That was finished 2 days early, so that's a good thing. We have had some complications on that project with trucks coming down the mountain. A very high rate of speed going through the intersection, had a couple of close calls there multiple times. So we're adding a truck arrest system on the mountain to try to help this issue in the future, once the roundabout is in place. So we're actually working and design for that right now to have that put in place around the time that we open the roundabout.
What is it? A truck arrest system?
So it's essentially a spot there, yeah, that will, if the truck is coming down the mountain and has lost brakes, it's a place for it to get off safely and not continue down.
I've seen them on I-70 in Denver.
I've seen them coming down the mountain too, but was that really the reason why they blew through there, or were they just not paying attention?
No, that's a big part of the reason. Yeah, I mean, they're losing brakes. So we're looking at other means to help our workforce be safe. Like if there's a vehicle coming down the mountain at a high rate of speed, to kind of alert the work zone, to let them know, get out of the way. So we've had 4 to 5 close calls there through construction. Yeah. And if it wasn't for the flaggers having air horns for one, it probably would have been a pretty disastrous situation. But I mean, the good thing is we got approval for this arrest system as part of the project to go in, so I think that's positive.
So up above Turnpike Road, where
It's gonna be a little bit further up now.
Will that stay in after the
Yes, it's
project is
permanent.
completed? Okay.
Yes,
So is it like the runaway truck ramps? Is it an actual ramp?
it's gonna be a ramp with apparatus that will slow the truck down as it
Oh,
goes
harness.
through.
I like an aircraft carrier.
I could tell.
A big car.
Yes. So I mean, we're actively working through the design part of that now, because I don't feel comfortable without it being there. Based on what we've gone through over the last 6 months.
I didn't know anything about this.
You guys don't have mountains out there. They're pretty cool.
And that project, both at the DEI, we should be wrapping all that up by the first quarter of 2023. So that's moving along. Thank you all for that meeting that we had for the hydraulic bundle. I was at the CTV meeting last week. We did a presentation regarding that. I believe it's going through well. The CTV will vote on it next month. I think the project will continue moving forward. And once we get that approval with that additional funding, we're going to release the RFP to try to get a contract on board here to get these projects filled.
Only thing that I'll add, the 12 smart scale projects in this region are 12 out of 412 in the state. So the work is, pretty large to get all of those scored and ready by January. And then of course we come right on the heels of that with the revenue sharing and transportation alternatives application cycle. So we're beginning to make ready for that. There is a grant opportunity available for our smaller non-MPO area localities. That's transportation alternatives in particular has allocations are done by population level. And so that smallest group, the 5,000 and below, is a difficult one to get applications in. So we're going to be working with some of our localities to help them prepare applications. There is going to be a public involvement opportunity this fall. In years past, we've had our CTV has hosted a fall open house to allow localities, the public in general, to come in and provide feedback. The last few years we haven't had that. We've done the required spring public hearing, but with COVID, it made it difficult. So we will have an opportunity this fall. No date yet, but it'll be before December 7th when we're back together. So I wanted to let you know.
I will say that the DVI out at 250 in the interstate, the way that it's been managed from, I mean, I think people were expecting it to be a nightmare to get through there, and it really hasn't. To work on Pantop, so with the exception of 1 or 2 days that are typically crash related, not construction related, that's gone really smooth, so.
That's good. to hear.
I think our board appreciates that tremendously, how that's.
Contractor knows it's a very sensitive area, so he's doing what he needs to do.
That's appreciated. Councilor Banks, the city.
No, sir.
Mayor Snow.
No.
Yeah. Supervisor Valley.
Nothing for me, thank you.
Anything I will report on, I don't think I mentioned this before, but we did have our railroad corridor study presented to the board. That was June, July. I don't know if it mentioned that here, but that was from the city line all the way up to about Hut over by the Fashion Square Mall. So the whole corridor study, it's done in 2 phases, the east side and the west side. Identified a lot of its needs, some that are in for smart scale, some, obviously the Warner roundabout is proceeding. But I thought that was good. That's our second corridor study we've done in the county. So it's nice to have that done. I'll be curious to see if we're successful with this, the Safe Streets for All grant, how having some corridor studies in place already will help inform. It should. So that's in the second piece. All right. Thank you, everybody, for the inputs. Not added to the agenda, so we will go again to the public. Any matters from the public? Neil, any? Just the things up. Anyone online that would like to give public comment? Not seeing any hands raised. All right, so we will close matters from the public, and that brings us to, or is there any other items here?
The next meeting is December 7th. I sent out a calendar hold for everybody. I closed my PowerPoint, but I have it flashing specifically for, bring attention, December 7th.
That's the next one.
That will be the next meeting.
All right, so we will, December 7th, that's.
Should be Wednesday.
Yeah, interesting for us.
You said that.
Yeah.
We all got it. Well, that's the
That's a
first
board meeting.
Wednesday, of course, that's the first Wednesday.
Okay.
This is our annual conundrum when we try to combine them.
Yeah, I think we have already voted on it at the beginning of the meeting, so maybe I will send out a meeting poll.
Well, we will adjourn today. Determine what the next meeting date will be. So yes, if there's no objection, we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.